This episode of Primitive Culture is brought to you by Audible.com, offering more than 180,000 titles for smartphone, tablet and desktop. To get a free audiobook of your choice and to help Trek FM at the same time, visit audibletrial.com/trekfm. And also by Enterprise in Space, an international program of the non-profit National Space Society. Find out how you can help science and education and become a virtual crew member aboard the NSS Enterprise Orbiter by visiting enterpriseinspace.org. And if you want to join the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode, join the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field. We look forward to seeing you there.
This is Tim Russ, Lieutenant Commander Tuvok on Star Trek Voyager, and you're listening to Trek FM.
Open your mind to the past. Oh, this may mean something.
I've been coerced into watching tonight's movie.
You do have books in the 24th century.
It's a primitive culture. I'm just trying to blend in.
Some people think the future means the end of history. We haven't run out of history quite yet.
Hello and welcome to Primitive Culture, a Trek FM podcast all about our history, our culture and how Star Trek relates to it. I'm Duncan Barrett, and joining me is a blast from the past and a semi-regular fixture on Primitive Culture here. I think we can fairly say he's objectively one of our favourite guests on this show these days. It's Tony Black. How are you, Tony?
I'm very well, Duncan. Thank you. Objectively is an interesting word there, I think. You know, maybe it's a subjective view. Who knows?
I don't know. I think there are some things that we can say with absolute certainty that kind of go beyond subjective personal opinions, and I think it's fair to say that that's one of them. But it's great that you could join me today here, Tony, because this is a conversation that we've been planning for quite some time. I think we first came up with this episode back in October when we first saw the DS9 documentary up in Birmingham, in your stomping ground, as it were, to talk about this film that I believe is a real favourite of yours. One that I hadn't seen recently, but a really iconic work, perhaps, for you. Something that is up there for you, you know, with the James Bonds and the X-Files and so on. And so we hatched this plan long ago last year to talk about this film, and now finally we're getting to do it.
Yes. We are absolutely talking about Weekend at Bernie's 2. No, I'm joking. I'm actually not I'm not actually a huge long-term fan of this, Duncan, I'm afraid. This is something I saw very recently, actually. So I think the facts in this case are a little bit askew.
That's very strange, but we definitely hatched this plan back in October in Birmingham, didn't we? I mean, this is not something that I've just come up with in the last week or so because we couldn't be bothered to do the research for the big historical episode that we were supposed to be doing. I mean, you know, this is something that we've had in the schedule, you know, going back months. I mean, before even you'd planned your kind of return on a semi-regular basis to Primitive Culture. We've had this on the roster, haven't we?
Again, I'm not sure I quite remember things the way you do, Duncan. We were definitely in Birmingham for the DS9 doc. I definitely messaged you and said, I haven't done my research for the historical episode. But I don't think we've been planning this that long. I think we're on different truth tracks here.
Well, maybe we'll just have to agree to disagree in that case. But the one thing that I think we can agree on right now, I hope, is what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about the seminal 1950 movie, Japanese movie Rashomon, or I have a feeling, and I should have asked Chris Jones before we started recording, that it may actually be pronounced Rashomon, just looking at the kind of little marks and so on in my book of the stories that this film was based on. But I think we'll go with Rashomon because, as far as I know, that's how everyone in the West certainly refers to this film.
Yeah.
And it is true, regardless of what I said before, it is true that the part of the idea for this was seeded in the back of my mind by a comment that Armin Shimmerman makes in the DS9 documentary, out this week, I think, on physical media and download and so on, in which there's a conversation about this story that allegedly happened where his and Max Grodenchik's heads got switched and they ended up wearing the wrong face masks or something. And one of them tells this story and then one of them says, no, that never happened. And then Ira Stephen Bear says, oh my God, you've undermined the kind of premise of this whole documentary if you're all contradicting each other. And Armin Shimmerman says, no, it's fine. It's Rashomon. It's great. You know, people will love it. And in fact, of course, in the documentary, they make a real strength of that, and they have this kind of comment right at the beginning with Andrew Robinson saying, you know, some of this may not be true, and kind of emphasizing the fact that people looking back on things that they remember from the past, that their accounts may not be totally reliable, and that just because you're making what you're calling a documentary about something doesn't mean that you're guaranteeing that everything in there is necessarily objectively factually true. And in some cases there may be room for varying memories or varying interpretations or kind of subjective experiences of those shared experiences.
Yeah, it's a fascinating concept, this, and it goes back to Rashomon, I think, is one of the things that really sort of set it out there for people. You know, it even coined the Rashomon effect, which is it's all about the reliability of the narrator, or the so-called unreliable narrator, and the idea that you can take an event and you can see it from multiple perspectives, and quite often it's about the subjectivity of that event. And how you may all have a different version of what in other cases could be an objective truth. And in many senses, there could be this effect could really affect the majority of things out there. You know, we all view life through a very subjective lens, through our own experiences and our own memories and things like that. And sometimes you have, you know, quite often you will have an objective thing that actually happened and was witnessed by many people. But equally, there are many cases out there, both legal cases, both, you know, narratives, you know, just things that happen in daily life where you could apply the so-called Rashomon effect to it. And it's something that is really surprisingly prevalent in fiction and in Star Trek. You know,
well, it's almost kind of emblematic, I suppose, of the boundary between fiction and non-fiction in some ways, insofar as we expect non-fiction to be accurate and factual and about the truth, and this idea of there being sort of objective truth and one version being correct. Whereas obviously fiction allows us more sort of leeway to engage with, well, things that literally aren't true, but also with kind of taking more liberties with the truth and so on. I mean, it's something that interests me because I spend a lot of my time interviewing people about their own experiences, often going back many, many years. I mean, I've just got back from a weekend of talking to people about their experiences working in a factory in Liverpool in the 1950s, 60s onwards. And sometimes people will say, you know, this is a long time ago, you know, don't expect me to remember everything totally accurately. And the interesting thing is, if you interview several people, you inevitably start getting different versions of the same event that they will remember differently, you know, down to sometimes quite significant details. And even the same person, because I've often gone back and interviewed the same person again to get a bit more information, and they end up telling you the same story they told you last time, and you end up with two interviews that do in some ways contradict each other. And when I first started kind of working with these kind of accounts and writing these books, I was a bit anxious about this, and I was thinking, well, what do I do? Because, you know, these things can't both be true. In the end, I became quite kind of cynical about it, and basically decided I'd pick whatever suits me the best and go with that in each given instance. Because when there are things, and they're not usually huge things, they are generally you know, more sort of minor kind of subjective things and so on. But that is what storytelling is. And, you know, when we tell stories, whether they're true stories or fictitious stories, particularly if they're stories that we tell over and over again in our lives and we kind of hone and that we kind of repeat, and that they become kind of a part of our identity, inevitably that sort of idea of who we are and what our life means and what that particular story is about. And also the audience, because people might tell me a story differently, you know, as a kind of historian in quote marks, than they might tell a friend down the pub or whatever. You know, how we kind of modify these stories for a particular audience. But I suppose where it becomes problematic is in all these stories that we're looking at, and Rashomon being the kind of almost sort of patient zero of this trope, in a sense, is key to this as well. There's usually a kind of judicial or a legal aspect to what is going on, and therefore there is a kind of assumption that there is a truth to be found and that someone's job is to find that truth. And what you get in Rashomon, I mean, the film Rashomon, it's a 1950 film by Kurosawa. It's, broadly speaking, it's about an encounter between three people in a bamboo grove, and it's actually adapted largely not from confusingly, it's adapted from 2 short stories. One which is called Rashomon, which has almost nothing to do with the film. It only really, they took the framing device for the film, which is this conversation that takes place by underneath a giant gate in a rainstorm. That's the Rashomon part. The actual story is taken from this short story in a bamboo grove, and really what it's about is there's this married couple and a bandit. And the man in the couple ends up dead and the woman ends up being raped. But exactly how that played out and what happened, and even, actually who killed the man, whether it was the bandit or whether it was, all 3 of them are kind of fingered for the crime in different accounts, is all sort of presented in these differing accounts where people are A, deliberately lying, to serve their own interests, but B, also kind of constructing a certain version of events that is not necessarily such a kind of naked lie, but is more about this kind of subjective experience. And there's a great line in the film, because in this framing narrative that takes place, at the gate, there's a sort of discussion of what it all means in a sense. And one of the characters says, people are only people. That's why they lie. They can't even admit the truth to themselves. And I think that's really the key thing about these kind of Rashomon stories, or this Rashomon trope in a sense, is it's not just that some people lie, because you get that in any detective story. You get that in any courtroom drama. There's someone who's lying and someone who's telling the truth. It's the idea that somehow everyone is in some way lying, that experience and memory is so subjective that it's impossible to give a kind of perfect. In Star Trek, you might think, Data is the one who could do that. And there is in the episode, The Defector, I think Picard says he asks Data to record a log of what's going on because he's the only member of the crew who can kind of record a genuinely objective account in a way. But so there's always this kind of legal process going on. There's always someone that the stories are being told to. And in the short story in a bamboo grove, it's literally, although it's, prose fiction, it's essentially a series of chunks of dialogue. So it will say, the woodcutter to the magistrate, and then he'll say, I was going along cutting wood and then I stumbled upon this thing. And it's basically just a series of speeches from each of the people. So the reader is almost in the role of the listener, of the magistrate adjudicating this case. When you get to Rashomon, I don't think you ever see the kind of judge figure, do you? They kind of talk to the camera, basically. It's this idea of like direct address, telling these stories. And I think that's a big part of it, and one of the elements that Star Trek ends up borrowing, particularly later on in Deep Space Nine, when you get to the episode Rules of Engagement, which is fairly heavily influenced, I think, in some ways by this film and by this kind of idea to some extent anyway. And you get again that kind of direct address to the camera, which is very striking. And Rashomon as a film, I think, was quite sort of controversial at the time that it was made. It was a really groundbreaking piece of work because it did do a lot of sort of playing with cinematic expectations and so on. Not just this inherently kind of subversive idea that somehow truth is all relative and that no one can stake claim to knowing the exact truth, but even the way that it's told, because it cuts back and forth between these different time frames. You've got the people speaking to the judge, you've got the flashbacks to what they're saying happened, which play out differently in the different versions, and then you've got this kind of framing narrative at the gate. And apparently at the time, many people, reading the script and indeed watching this film were completely confused by it. It's a bit like, with Tarantino and Pulp Fiction. Everyone was like, oh my God, what's going on here? It's chopped up all over the shop. This is not what we expect from a film, especially in 1950. So it was a kind of, a really iconic, cinematic moment, I guess, and part of it is the style and the form of it, which is a big part of it, but part of it also is this kind of quite radical idea that's at the heart of it, and the two, I suppose, are melded together one way or another.
The Star Trek episode that most directly, there is quite a few that play with the idea of the unreliable narrator and the concept of different subjective versions of truth. The one that I suppose is the most clearly inspired by Rashomon is A Matter of Perspective in season 3 of The Next Generation, which is obviously Riker becoming embroiled in the case of a scientist who he's accused of murdering when his space station blows up. And much like Rashomon, it involves a woman who is claiming that he came onto her. And she is a classic example of the kind of, Dr. Apgar's wife in that is the classic example of the kind of character who believes her own truth. And there's that moment where she's been interviewed about it, and Riker says to Deanna, well, I didn't do this. I didn't do this. And she says, well, it is the truth as each of you remember it. So that's sort of the key to this. The subjectivity of this kind of narrative can sometimes be, unless someone is, as you say, directly lying, quite often people might genuinely believe the perspective of what they're seeing. And in this case, she did, and you go through the episode wondering if she's in on it, or she might be the killer, or she might have been involved, or there might be some conspiracy, because we obviously know that Riker isn't likely to have blown up a space station and killed a guy. That's kind of not the point. The point is, what is the story? And they find quite an inventive sort of techno-babbly way, I suppose, of getting around this in the episode, even if it may be a little bit cheap, because it sort of saves everyone's bacon in a way. But it is that whole idea that just because she believed that Riker had killed her husband doesn't necessarily mean that what she thought was wrong in a way. Even she got the facts wrong, but she believed that what she thought was right, she thought was true. And that's a really fascinating way of doing it. It could have been that they were all lying and we just see things from different perspectives, and then we find out, oh, well, obviously Riker was telling the truth. But it's not quite that simple. And I did like that aspect about A Matter of Perspective. It's
an interesting episode. I mean, I feel it's quite a problematic episode because of the element of sexual violence. And actually, you could say Rashomon, one thing that is not disputed in all the accounts, for what it's worth, is the fact that the bandit rapes the wife. Now, they do kind of bring in almost the same effect, because basically in some versions afterwards, she decides to run away with the bandit and forsake her husband. And do you know what I mean? So her reaction to it is not what you would expect. So there is still this question. I think with all these stories, there's this sort of question of the role of the woman and this idea of sort of doubt and kind of distrust and everything, particularly in this kind of archetypal setup where you've got, these two men and this woman in the center of it. It's the woman somehow where all the biggest mystery, resides, if you know what I mean. She's almost the one with the problem. Like there is this kind of fundamental problem, but she's kind of, at the heart of it. Somehow, what is going on in her head? What is going on with her behaviour? She's this sort of unknowable woman. And I think there is
she's femme fatale in a way. She is a bit of a femme fatale.
Yeah, she is almost, particularly in Rashomon. I mean, in the TNG episode, I think it's deeply problematic. I mean, the fact that Riker's being accused of rape, for a start, calling the episode A Matter of Perspective and making it about a rape story is deeply dubious, I think, in itself. Secondly, that line that Troy says of, she believes this is what happened. And he's like, well, this is not what happened. It's kind of, it almost plays into this sort of fantasy of the falsely accused man. Do you know what I mean? Who did nothing wrong. And yet this woman is sort of magically convinced that he raped her. I don't know. I find it very problematic. And I think actually the episode never really gets to the bottom of that. It never really explains how is it possible that this woman believes that Riker raped her and he believes that she was coming onto him pretty strong, but, nothing really happened.
But it plays more with the idea that Riker is the ladies' man, doesn't it? It's sort of, the whole sort of story is, predicated on you having some level of understanding that Riker quite often does charm the women on these away missions. And, he's been that kind of, handsome, tall, dark, handsome figure. And it's playing on that perspective of, well, Riker could well have gone down there. It kind of wants you in a way to believe that maybe Riker was being a bit full on with her and did fancy her and all this, but then it's firmly in his corner, isn't it? It is firmly in his corner all the way through. And it, like you say, I think that's absolutely true, actually, that it is sort of from that perspective of, well, she's obviously lying.
But I don't think it ever quite, I think Troy's line is very problematic from that point of view, because Troy's line suggests she reasonably feels that Riker did something that we sort of believe that he didn't. And it's almost impossible to know, did he do it or not? And obviously in a legal sense, maybe that's true. I mean, that's one of the reasons that rape cases, very rarely, I don't know if they very rarely, one of the problems with prosecuting rape cases is that because it's two people in a room and you've only got two people's accounts and not necessarily any evidence about intention or kind of, exactly what was going on in there. If one says that it was consensual and one says that it wasn't. But at the same time, most people, I think, would assume, therefore, that one of them is lying. But what Troy is suggesting is that neither of them is lying. And that's because, of course, having Troy, and this is one of those episodes where having Troy there like screws with the concept of the episode because she ought to know the answer. Do you know what I mean? She ought to be able to solve it. And so they have to give her a way of not solving the problem. But in this case, I feel like it creates a whole bigger problem where you're left thinking, well, hang on. So what really did, and you know, what has Riker been up to? And this is kind of pretty shady. But then the episode sort of sidesteps that because it kind of leaves all of that by the wayside. It completely loses interest in the sexual violence aspect of it because it becomes all about the kind of sci-fi business going on and why did the station explode, and they find out the solution that explains why, you know, Riker didn't need to pull a phaser for the right beam of thing to set off the reaction that did the explosion, whatever it is. And it's almost like everyone sort of forgets about this really problematic element of it, that we have someone who it says that he's raped her and Troy says she's not lying. And like, and what do we say? Are we saying she's complete, you know, is she crazy? Is she, do you know what I mean? What is going on with this woman? And it's not really ever addressed. And I do think that sort of ties it to the Rashomon story because there's this idea of sort of, you know, this seemingly quite demure wife character who the more we find out about her, the more puzzling and strange and untrustworthy she seems, if you know what I mean. It sort of seems to tap into that somehow in a slightly uncomfortable way, I would say. What's
interesting with Star Trek episodes that have the Rashomon effect is they quite often approach these stories from not just the perspective of a character, but from the mindset of a character. This is particularly the case with Worf. You know, Rules of Engagement is a similar kind of story to A Matter of Perspective. It's more angled on the political side of things in some senses. You know, that Worf is dragged into this. You know, it takes place within the Federation Klingon hostilities after Way of the Warrior and throughout season 4 of Deep Space Nine. So you've got that bubbling underneath, and it goes back to the, you know, Worf's whole arc all the way through since the dishonor of his father and all these things about how he's still always struggling to find his place in Klingon society. But it's built on this idea of, could Worf have made a terrible mistake that cost the lives of these people? And what is his truth? You know, and quite often you've got the main characters who are, you know, there's the O'Brien who comes in and he says, well, you know, Worf's an honourable man. He would never do this. And then he's grilled from the perspective of, well, would you have done it? And he's like, well, no, I wouldn't have done it. But that, and so it's interesting the way it does a different spin on it. I mean, I think it's a stronger episode. I think it's better written because it actually, it's a more of a military tribunal kind of story than A Matter of Perspective is. That's not as much of a Worf's in the middle of a trial, whereas Riker's sort of on trial, but he's not. It's more about deciding whether he should be put on trial, I suppose. But I think it's a stronger story because it taps more into the psychology of Worf as a character than Matter of Perspective is more about playing on the trope of Riker and what you might expect of him. And I think in that sense, it's a simpler story. It might be a bit more tuned into Rashomon in a way, but, you know, A Matter of Perspective. But I think Rules of Engagement does it with a little bit more nuance.
Yes, I think you could, yeah, absolutely. A Matter of Perspective is not particularly nuanced, probably. Even, you know, going back to the very first, like the teaser of that episode is this slightly clunky setup, where they're all in the art class and everyone's painting the same model in different styles.
And
do you know
Picard's,
to the point where
Picard's painting is terrible. Did you see that?
Poor old Picard.
Like,
I mean, you know, Data should see Janeway's attempts at painting that we get later on in Voyager.
Oh God,
I thought Picard's painting wasn't that bad, to be honest. But literally to the point where one of them has drawn this naked lady in a kind of surreal style as a violin. Like, okay, I mean, right?
Yeah, that was really strange.
You're labouring the point here slightly that you know that experiences can be subjective or whatever. Because again, it's this weird thing where they actually, it's not that they all see this woman slightly differently. They're painting in complete, you know, one of them is doing a kind of Picasso, one of them is doing a sort of, you know, whatever, Dali or something, and one of them is, I can't remember what the other one is. Picard's doing something kind of, he's doing something sort of vaguely cubist or something. Like, they're all approaching it in a very different style anyway, but arguably there's something slightly clunky about A Matter of Perspective. I think it's quite clever the way that it uses the holodeck. I mean, for my money, both these episodes are flawed, but they're both, I don't think they're bad episodes. I think they're both quite interesting in different ways. Interestingly, Rules of Engagement, I was looking up in the DS9 companion. Ira Steven Behr came down really hard on that episode. He said basically they had all these great ideas for it. They thought it was going to be a brilliant idea, but they became too focused on the kind of formal aspect of it as a kind of writing exercise. And he said he felt, which I think there is some truth to this, that they kind of lost track of Worf slightly in the episode. And that actually there are long sections of the episode where Worf doesn't really do anything or say anything, even though it's supposed to be an episode all about Worf. And that somehow he felt that when what he says is that they all thought it was going to be this great episode, and then they watched it back after they'd shot it and they were like, oh, we did, and they didn't feel they'd quite nailed it. Now, I would say there are lots of good things about that episode, though. It's directed very well, I think, by LeVar Burton. It does have this quite sort of striking address to camera, which is something that I don't think Star Trek had ever done before that. Obviously, we get it again later on within The Pale Moonlight. We get, Avery Brooks doing pretty much a monologue to camera, basically. But it's quite a bold decision and is carried off well. Interestingly, I was sort of wondering when I was watching it, was that LeVar Burton's idea? Who was it who brought in that idea, which, as I say, does very much pick up on the kind of Rashomon style. But apparently that was in the script, and that was Ira Steven Behr's idea. Ronald D. Moore wrote the episode, but it was Ira who came up with it, who said that he wanted them to speak to camera, basically. But aside from the very fact they speak to camera, it's also quite clever in the way that it plays, again, a bit like Rashomon, between these different time frames and different, it doesn't just jump, it doesn't just cut back and forth between the person giving their testimony and the kind of reenactment of that testimony. And again, as Rashomon does, presenting that differently. So, for example, in Rashomon, the bandit in some people's accounts is more sort of sweaty and more kind of scary than in other. Do you know what I mean? There are kind of differences as to kind of the presentation. But what it also does, which is quite clever, is they start narrating from within the action, if you know what I mean. So they're narrating to camera, but the scene is playing around them. And apparently there were lots of other elements, like the visual effects people. They wanted they were very definite to kind of shoot their sequences that were going to be repeated differently. So they didn't want to like reuse footage, essentially. It's almost some of the same challenge that you get with something like Cause and Effect, where you're kind of replaying the same thing again and again, because in some ways that's what's happening in these stories, where you're kind of, certainly in Rashomon, you really are kind of, you're not exactly replaying the same events because the events are different according to who's telling the story, but you are sort of replaying the same, situation, and a lot of the nuances come out of that. And also it made me think a bit, I mean, one reason that I did suggest this idea to you, because it made me think very much of the X-Files episode Bad Blood, which is definitely a kind of Rashomon inspired episode, where you basically see, and it's quite a funny episode. This is an episode where there's a guy who is he a vampire or isn't he a vampire, and Mulder ends up killing him in the teaser, seemingly. And then Mulder and Scully we don't really see the kind of tribunal element of it, but we see them trying to get their stories straight beforehand. And so we get Scully's version of what happened and then Mulder's version of what happened. And what struck me as interesting about that is the idea of kind of subjectivity is not radical at all for the X-Files, because every episode you could say you basically get Mulder's version and Scully's version of what's happened. But what you get in this instance is Mulder's version of Scully and Mulder's version of Mulder, and Scully's version of Scully and Scully's version of Mulder. So it's a lot of it is really about like how the actors therefore have to play. Each one of them in effect has to play three characters, because they have to play their regular character. They have to play their sort of character's best self as they imagine themselves, and then their character's worst self as their partner imagines them. So in Scully's version, Mulder is really arrogant and annoying. And in Mulder's version, Scully is really sarcastic and rude, basically. But they also kind of both play themselves up in a more positive way as well. So it kind of, but the other thing I think is interesting about it is that it's played for laughs. And with the X-Files, it sees to me like there's that episode. There's also, Jose Chung's From Outer Space. Is that what it's called? Which sort of plays with sort of unreliable, like different narrators telling bizarre stories that don't quite add up. It always seems like this idea is sort of fundamentally comic, whereas, Rashomon is a drama, and when Star Trek plays it, it's absolutely it's dead serious. Do you know what I mean? Like, the stakes are high. Riker could, he says at one point, I've got a noose around my neck. Worf could end up extradited to Kronos, and, again, he could potentially be executed as well. It's these people who are on trial and the stakes are extremely high. It just sort of struck me what is what is it about these issues that, one show or one franchise or whatever sees them as quite fundamentally serious, these kind of issues of subjectivity and the unknowability of things, and another sees it as a kind of hilarious opportunity to kind of undercut the sort of reality of, because I suppose arguably normally TV, it is quite an objective medium in some ways. I mean, you can get subjective experience in the way that you shoot it and so on, but in a kind of literal sense, you are seeing one thing on the screen and everyone watching it is seeing the same thing. Do you know what I mean? I mean, even if they might interpret it differently, there is a kind of objective reality to it, even as it plays with subjectivity within it.
Well, I think I think you hit the nail on the head when you're talking about the X-Files. The difference, I think, the reason that they play it for comedy in the X-Files is because every week you have some level of subjectivity. You have some level of what is the truth, what isn't the truth. It has what these agents have been investigating been really what happened. And quite often you'll get episodes that the audiences are left unsure as to precisely what it meant or, what the truth was in that sense. Whereas with Star Trek, particularly, most episodes of traditional Star Trek are pretty much, what you see is what you're supposed to believe, is what happened. These people are professionals and they are, they're the good guys, usually, particularly in the pre, modern era Star Trek. And they're very linear narratives. Whereas I think with the X-Files, they play it for comedy because they're aware that it's about the perception of the characters more than anything else. Bad Blood is exactly that. Bad Blood is all about how these characters are perceived. And it's playing up to the audience's perception as well. In that episode, if you watch the X-Files, you understand that Mulder and Scully have particular characteristics. Mulder is particularly, driven by belief, and he will go out on the limb with all these theories, and Scully's the one every week who goes, well, maybe there's a scientific explanation. And in that episode, they play up the idea that Mulder is conversely this meek guy who's terrified of his really angry partner going, what are you talking about? This is rubbish. Or, on the other hand, he's this strident, confident, cocky, obviously I'm going to go and sort it out. And she's there just following his lead. And you're laughing at it because you're laughing at at the subversion of what these tropes are that you watch every week. And you're laughing at the actors playing up with that. And the similar kind of thing happens in Jose Chunks from Outer Space, which is a comedy episode written by a guy called Darren Morgan, who was famous in the X-Files for writing comedy episodes that lampoon particularly Mulder in those episodes, because he finds Mulder ridiculous, this writer, and he every time he writes him in such a way. So that episode, which is all about alien abduction and again, actually, is a problematic sexual assault at the core of that story, funnily enough. And it's about whether aliens abducted this girl or something else happened to her. And you do see things from various different perspectives. As this girl says in that, well, they're stealing my memories. And you never quite know if it's the government. You never quite know if it's aliens. You don't know if it's men dressed up as aliens and all this kind of thing. Whereas, because Star Trek is grounded in a sort of truth, I think it's a bit more afraid of the kind of fractured truth narrative than the X-Files is. I think it's more afraid to actually put these characters through a situation where you might have to question their veracity. You might have to question their nobility or their sense of right and wrong. And that's why, much as I like the episodes that deal with this, ultimately they're rooted in something that won't stick, because full well that Riker's probably not done what he's done. Full well that Worf wouldn't knowingly go out there and blow up innocent people. Full well in Living Witness, which is another good episode for this, that in Voyager, where the Doctor is found 700 years later by a race who have built into their history the idea that Voyager was a warship and created this great intergalactic war. Full well Janeway didn't do that. So you come into it from a perspective of, that this isn't true as an audience member, and that what you're seeing, these subjective narratives, ultimately should prove the heroism or the veracity of these characters and love. Whereas it's not quite that simple in some of these other cases of the Rashomon effect. It could leave you wondering what's true and what isn't. Whereas Star Trek's a bit afraid to do that, I think.
I think that's absolutely true. And yeah, I think you're right. Some of the more effective examples of this trope playing out are the ones that are willing to kind of live with a degree of uncertainty and a degree of kind of mystery. I think you're right. Certainly when you look at Voyager, you look at episodes like Living Witness or Author is the other one, where you get like a fictionalized version of events, or a kind of a fake version of Voyager in a sense. And in both cases, it's that they're all really horrible, and that these lovely guys who, we know the sort of Starfleet characters, we love them, they're decent people and so on. The idea that they're not. I mean, Living Witness, you see, to me, I know some people talk about it as a kind of Rashomon inspired story. To me, that's not, it doesn't sort of hit that trope in the same way, because it doesn't have this idea of multiple perspectives. It's really just one perspective, and it's wrong. And it's so wrong that there's kind of, it's obvious. Do you know what I mean? To us as the viewer, there's no question that it could be, that any of it could be true. Author, I feel like the Doctor's version of it, it's so extreme that it makes itself ridiculous. I mean, that is an example of playing this kind of thing for comedy in Star Trek, I suppose, like the X-Files was playing it for comedy. But you see, I think there's a kind of fundamental problem with Author in that by playing it so absurd, it actually undercuts what is potentially a serious issue underneath it, which is the Doctor feeling that he has not always been treated as a, full person in a sense by the rest of the characters. And actually there are elements in Author that tap into earlier episodes. And yes, they're pushed to the extreme and they're made ridiculous, but there's a kernel of truth there. And again, what the episode does in this kind of Star Trek way is it sort of, sweeps that all back under the carpet by the end, if you know what I mean, because it kind of, it makes it all seem ridiculous, and then it doesn't really get an airing, if you know what I mean. Then the Doctor kind of has to go back on himself, and and you lose this sense of actually, was there to some degree a genuine grievance there with, say, the way that Janeway behaved towards him? I mean, you had the episode, Latent Image, a few seasons before, which is quite an interesting episode because you see Janeway kind of changing her position on the Doctor a bit, but certainly at the beginning of that episode being quite unsympathetic towards him and saying, she has that line to 7 and 9. She says he's not that different from a replicator. Whereas I feel like with Author, the way they write it, it kind of eliminates all of that in a way by pushing it to the absurd level. But you're right. There's absolutely, Star Trek wants to kind of make it safe. It wants to make it obvious. To some degree, it wants to make it obvious who is lying. And I suppose you're right. We do sort of, we do kind of trust Riker, I suppose, more than we trust this woman who we've never met before. Although, that in itself maybe is a slightly problematic kind of setup. But I suppose there is this sort of question of, who's lying, who's telling the truth, what's their, someone is telling the truth and someone is lying. Whereas really when you've got the kind of Rashomon idea, it's more, this more sort of fundamental idea that everyone is lying all the time somehow. And that doesn't really fit with Star Trek somehow. With Star Trek, I feel it's a bit more like, have you ever watched that panel show, Would I Lie to You? Where you have, celebrities and they tell stories and they're either telling true stories or they're just making something up and they have to guess whether they're lying or not. It's a bit more like that. It's the it's not so much about the subjectivity of general lived experience and memory in some kind of fundamental human sense. It's more, sometimes people lie and it is almost a bit more like that kind of procedural thing. I think when Ron Moore was talking about writing that DS9 episode, he said he wasn't inspired by Rashomon really. He was inspired by Perry Mason and and actually LeVar Burton as well, as although he went and watched Rashomon as an inspiration, he said he also watched loads of episodes of LA Law. So I suppose there's that kind of, there's the kind of almost, I suppose, the more highbrow influence, but then there's also the more kind of nuts and bolts influences, whether that's in the writing or the directing or whatever. And all those things kind of come together with these stories, I think. And actually one thing I noticed today that hadn't struck me before when I was rewatching a couple of these episodes is the director of A Matter of Perspective, by a funny coincidence, is Cliff Bole, big Star Trek director. And he also directed that X-Files episode Bad Blood. Yeah. So, whether that was just a coincidence or someone thought, oh, he's got good form on these, sort of split, unreliable, whatever you call it, these kind of Rashomon stories.
Could be.
But I think the director has a big part to play in, like, how do you I mean, the writer sets the tone to a large extent, but the director has a big part to play in sort of how do you represent these differences in these different realities, and how do you are they subtle enough that they feel sort of real and confusing and genuinely troubling for the audience, or do you make them safe by kind of pushing them to extremes one way or another?
Well, I mean, I think it's fair to say that Rashomon is probably Akira Kurosawa's most famous movie. It's the film that, I mean, if anyone knows much about film, he's probably the most famous Japanese, filmmaker ever. He's like, the equivalents of people like Stanley Kubrick, in the US, just an absolutely groundbreaking seminal director. And he made some really well-known movies, The Seven Samurai, things like that, Yojimbo, all these Ran, all these kind of films. But Rashomon's the one that really not only put him on the map, but actually has really stuck in people's minds and created, like I say, this ripple effect throughout literature. And it was, the idea of perspective was obviously there beforehand, but Rashomon did it in a different way. Rashomon really put you in the middle of a scenario where you came out the back of that never quite sure which was the real truth. And ultimately, it sort of created the idea that everyone's truth is their own. Everyone's truth is individual, that everybody ultimately is going to look at things through a particular perspective. And even if there is a rational, objective truth at the end of it, there is an unassailable fact. This happened. He did that. She did this, whatever. You will have people go through life who don't believe it. And, look at what we're going through right now, not to be too on the nose about things, but, we might as well be living in the middle of Rashomon right now in terms of politically, socially. No one knows what the truth is, even more so than ever right now, because everyone is living their own narrative to some extent, living their own truth. They're putting their own belief on things.
And we've literally had, in the last week or so when we've been recording, a rare example, I think, of something where, you're very interested in the X-Files and the kind of conspiracy theories and so on. We've had something happen. This is the, I have to work out the apparent suicide of Jeffrey Epstein, where people from almost every element of the kind of spectrum believe in some kind of conspiracy. Do you know what I mean? It's a weird situation. Normally there's like one group of people banging on about a conspiracy. I have to say, for me personally, I read that headline. I was like, my first thought was, I don't believe that. Do you know what I mean? I think it's an example of something where, and maybe that is a sign of the times in a way, but normally there are certain things that some people don't believe and other people do believe. And I'm not one for conspiracy theories, generally speaking, but that is an odd example of an event that occurs in the news, and actually a very large number of people with wildly divergent beliefs about all sorts of other things almost instantly have the same reaction, which is, that is too convenient. That is too, do you know what I mean? That smells fishy. Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely. Right, and you are getting people go down a conspiracy rabbit hole with this stuff. I mean, personally, I think with conspiracies, the reason I love the X-Files and I love all these things is because they are fascinating stories and ideas. But I personally think I don't believe in conspiracies because I don't believe people are competent enough to pull them off most of the time, in the real world.
That's because you've never met the cigarette smoking man in real life, isn't it?
Well, exactly. This is it. I should have more faith in Section 31, shouldn't I, really, and all these people. Yeah. But I think it's a good example of particular truth, because majority of people would go, that's a bit dodgy, because this guy in this situation, he's sitting on potentially what could be an absolutely enormous, scandal in terms of some of the most powerful people in, government, politics, everything, in terms
royal
of
family,
really, the royal family, everything. It could unlock the biggest, scandal, in terms of abuse since, things like Project Operation U-Tree and all these things that happened. And you think to yourself, well, this is a bit too convenient, but then it could be all kinds of different factors. You could build a Rashomon story around what happened to this guy. You could have the potential conspiracy theory. You could have the fact it was negligence. You could have the fact that he killed himself. You could, and you could do that with lots of these different examples. You could do it with any conspiracy theory story, really. You could do it with the JFK, you could do it with the Princess Diana and all these things. And I suppose that's why sometimes you do get films. I think there was one called Vantage Point, actually, which was starred Dennis Quaid about 10 years ago, which I quite enjoyed, which was built around a bomb going off, I think, in Spain. And it was like a 24 style espionage thriller. And it was a Rashomon story. It was different perspectives of this explosion going off before you got to a certain truth. And it was fairly formulaic, ultimately. I think ultimately there was a bad guy and the guy gets him and everything. But it did approach it from different perspectives. And I think that's why you can sort of port this storyline to all these different things. I think with Star Trek, the truth is that A Matter of Perspective is probably the most resolute Rashomon story that they've done. I think with all these other things, I think you're right. You know, I think even Rules of Engagement is more of a detective military tribunal kind of story than a Rashomon story. You know, there is a little bit less of that. Living Witness is more. I like Living Witness. It's not a Rashomon story in a way, but in a way it is, because it's all about. It's a different kind of perspective. It's not about an individual. It's about a culture and about a culture's approach to their own history, which Voyager happens to be involved in. And the Doctor comes in very much as the person turning around and saying, "Well, you've got history wrong. This isn't what happened. This isn't true. And if this is wrong, then what you've created over the last 700 years is built on a lie. So, you know, you might need to rethink your own destiny as a pair of cultures who were at war." So it's a different way of approaching this kind of idea of an absence of objective truth and people believing what they want to believe. And I think it's a good story in that sense, but I think it's flawed in the idea of it being a multi-perspective story, like A Matter of Perspective. I think the one I like the most in terms of the unreliable narrator is In the Pale Moonlight, because that's not a Rashomon story either in the same way, but it's the best unreliable narrator story in a way, or reliable narrator, depending on how you look at it. But it's if I'd love to have seen them do a proper Rashomon story around that episode, because you do end up with a compromised Cisco. That's one of the episodes that does leave the hero a little bit less heroic. You know,
and
forever.
It ends on doubt is the key thing.
Yeah,
it doesn't so much end on doubt as to what has happened, but it ends on doubt as to where Cisco is at the end of that story.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? I think you're right. You could. That is a story you could definitely have done. You could have had Garrett testifying and Quark testifying. You could totally have done that. But what it ends on is this kind of sense that he has that final line, "I think I can live with it." And the episode ends on this kind of question mark. Can he or can't, what's really going on in this man's soul, basically? And I suppose that's the interesting question. You get a discussion a bit like that in Rules of Engagement as well, that they're sort of saying, Cisco says, we can't put a man's heart on trial or something. And the Klingon says that's exactly what we have to do. And that really what it comes down to is what was going on for Worf at that moment. Was he acting purely rationally as a Starfleet officer, or was he acting out some kind of revenge fantasy, or was he kind of acting out this bloodlust because he has said, he said to Quark, I hope they come, I hope we get to fight, basically. He said these various other sort of compromising things to other people. And there is this sort of question, because there's that interesting bit where O'Brien says, well, I wouldn't have done it, essentially, but I don't want to say that he did the wrong thing, but I would have checked. And then there is this sort of sense at the end, once all that ambiguity is over, there is also a fairly clear line. Cisco basically says to him, "You were bloody stupid to do that without, to fire on that ship without absolutely confirming that it was what you thought it was."
But then he sort of spins it as Worf ultimately is learning a lesson to be a great captain one day.
That's true.
It doesn't end on Cisco walking out disappointed in him and Worf having this real doubt of, am I the man I thought I was, or am I truly? It doesn't do that. It does have that Cisco moment of indignation, but it's not as ballsy as in The Pale Moonlight, which does end on maybe Cisco. Cisco should not have done that, and he's lost a bit of his soul. And that's fantastic drama.
Well, ultimately, there are no stakes in the Rules of Engagement, in a sense, because none of these people have died after all. Nothing is written. No. Literally nothing is. The whole episode is about nothing. I mean, in A Matter of Perspective, this guy has died. He was a bit of a pain in the neck. No one's going to really be mourning.
Exactly.
They made him about as obnoxious as they could. Plus, he was dealing in some dodgy business that he shouldn't have been up to. So it's kind of all
Krieger waves.
Exactly. It's all his own fault. Anyway, but I think Star Trek does try to sort of, Star Trek has a tendency to sort of make everything all right at the end. And DS9 is the one Star Trek series that doesn't always do that. And you're right, In the Pale Moonlight absolutely avoids that in quite a compelling way. But I think Rules of Engagement, it does all sort of tie up. There is still a sense, though, because Sisko says to Worf at the end, he sort of tells him he's going to have to go to the party that's being held in his honour and he's going to have to pretend to enjoy it. I think there is a sense that Worf is troubled by it all because he has learnt something about himself, because he acknowledges at the very end, when it's sort of all safe and out of the way, he acknowledges that there was he was influenced in some way by those feelings that he was having and by these kind of less than totally noble intentions in a way. And I suppose that's one of the things that's quite interesting about these stories. I mean, in some ways, having Worf at the centre of this story, it makes a lot of sense, adapting this Japanese film, and not just a Japanese film from 1950, but a Japanese film that is set in the kind of ancient past and in this kind of world of kind of warriors and bandits and honour and and a lot of it is all about, the woman's dishonour for having been raped in front of her husband, and the husband's dishonour and the honour of the band, sort of not quite honour among thieves, but there is an element of that, because there's a point where the bandit does something that causes the husband to sort of respect him more, if you know what I mean. But it's because I think the wife says she wants to, in one of these versions, the wife says she wants to run away with a bandit, and the bandit is kind of shocked and asks the husband, do you want me to kill her now or whatever? And this all sounds awful, and it is if you think about it for 5 seconds. But I mean, it sort of plays into all these sort of ideas of like honor and guilt and kind of these, big sort of weighty issues that sort of hang around these individuals in a way that I don't think is really there in A Matter of Perspective, because I think you see, maybe that episode could have been more interesting in some ways if they had dared to play with the ambiguity, the fact that Riker is a bit of a ladies' man, he is a bit of a flirt. Is it possible that he sometimes slightly crosses the line and behaves a little bit inappropriately? And if they were able to play in a slightly greyer area, they could have made it more interesting, but at the same time, then you would be left with more serious questions about Riker in a way. And I feel like the episode sort of wants to bring all of that into it, partly because that's part of the Rashomon story and it's part of the kind of setup, but then conveniently sort of sidestep that into this discussion. Basically, I mean, in both those stories, what Star Trek does is, science saves the day. So, science saves the day in A Matter of Perspective because they discover that the holodecks created Krieger waves, and that, just like it created, this holodeck that creates Moriarty creates deadly waves that are destroying the ship, the holodeck is clearly massively overpowered, in Next Gen, but that basically they've sort of created this technical problem that gives an insight into the solution. And it turns out that they can sort of science the science and work out that actually, no one fired a phaser, and this science experiment business caused the explosion. In DS9, it's Odo kind of digging around and finding, in a very kind of X-Files moment really, that all the dead people who Worf has supposedly killed actually died 3 months earlier, and that the whole thing is a conspiracy and is a setup. And so again, this whole issue of, in the one, this sort of apparent alarming ambiguity around sexual consent and so on is swept by the wayside by this kind of science explanation. In the other, this whole kind of wrought issue around guilt and honor and the Klingon soul and violence and doing the right thing and duty and all these kind of issues, again, is sort of slightly sidestepped by the fact, actually, it was all complete fiction anyway. None of it ever happened. And I think it's kind of interesting. So Star Trek sort of squares the circle. It always comes up with this sort of satisfying resolution. The other story that came to my mind when we were thinking about this that I think is quite interesting in this respect is the play Copenhagen, which was a play written by Michael Frayn about a famous incident which happened during the Second World War when Werner Heisenberg, who was working on the German atomic bomb project, basically went to visit his old kind of mentor, basically Niels Bohr, in Copenhagen, and had this meeting went round to his house and had some kind of discussion with him, which in later years, no one could quite agree exactly what was said or what the purpose of this visit was or what it was really about. And, one theory is that Heisenberg was trying to warn Bohr about the German program. One theory is that he was trying to find out about Allied nuclear programs. And there's this sense in the play that, I think Heisenberg is this kind of key character in it, because there's also this sense of, how much is everyone lying to everyone else? Everyone knows all their homes are tapped and everything by the Nazis, so they know they're being listened to. Is Heisenberg basically actually, as he suggests at various points, they're trying to effectively sabotage the German program because he doesn't want to create a bomb, but he has to kind of play along with it and kind of act as if he's doing his best. And then there's this kind of sense of, this terrible responsibility that he has and this kind of weird game of trust that he's playing, that he at one point says he's hoping that Bohr will kind of do the same on the Allied, that basically on both sides, the scientists could kind of bluff their own superiors, in a sense, in order to prevent this almost inevitable but disastrous thing from happening. But in that play, it's all about the kind of fundamental uncertainty of these things. And it plays a lot with the idea of, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, the idea that you can't fully understand do you know what I mean? Literally in the act of observing it and kind of noting down, you kind of lose your ability to fully understand it. And one of the things that he says at one point is he felt this enormous pressure that he was someone who could affect the lives of millions of people potentially by, developing this bomb or not. But he's the one person that, a bit like in that X-Files episode, he's the one person that he doesn't have full understanding of. The people in this place, there's these two, and then there's Bohr's wife, that they can see each other somehow, but no one can ever fully know themselves or see themselves. And that makes it, that is this sort of fundamental existential problem that can never be resolved. Do you know what I mean? That's really what the play is kind of saying, is that there's this deep mystery at the heart of the human experience somehow, that we never fully understand ourselves and we never see ourselves as other people see us. And this can kind of come down even to the level of, on this kind of quite basic level, what was happening in this conversation where people were speaking guardedly in a very difficult situation, feeling very ambivalent. Heisenberg's very ambivalent himself. He doesn't want Germany to be destroyed. At the same time, he doesn't want to be responsible for killing millions of people. And there's also this interesting sense in that Bohr tells a story early on about a game of cards that they played where he won by bluffing everyone. And Heisenberg is sort of saying we couldn't believe it. We were all mathematicians. We were counting the cards. We knew it was almost impossible that you had the cards that you said that you did, but you seemed so confident. In the end, we all folded. And then Bohr says, "Oh, well, it turned out I'd misread my own cards. I bluffed myself." And that's this sort of idea that, you are unknowable even to yourself because your own, do you know what I mean? Like he's not even aware of what he's kind of full. Not only are people lying to each other, but I suppose this idea that they're lying to themselves, and that therefore ultimately everything that we know about other people and about ourselves is kind of unreliable. That there is no reliable narrator, in a sense. There is no kind of reliable source. Everything is fundamentally uncertain.
And that's a fascinating idea. And I suppose that's why this trope endures, because in some senses you wonder why with these stories Star Trek even bothered, in a way, because and a lot of these, like, older series that maybe just did this trope, with the X-Files, you can understand the reason there, particularly with Bad Blood, because it's played for laughs, and it's meant to be, like I said, an audience's reaction to these characters really well being sent up, and how they, there were a lot of episodes as the time went on with that show, which were all about how Mulder saw Scully and vice versa, and how it informed their dynamic and their relationship and their quest. Whereas with Star Trek, because it was a different kind of show and a different kind of approach, they almost feel disposable. We've sort of said this, but by the end of A Matter of Perspective, Riker's just back to being Riker, and they sail off in the ship, and they're all, fine and dandy. The guy's dead. Who cares? With Rules of Engagement, like you say, it was all a big conspiracy anyway. And yes, for Worf, he's left with a moment of, like, it's true. You did say that, and that is true, that he is left wondering a little bit, but it doesn't really inform his character particularly. After this, it's kind of all forgotten, really. So you think to yourself, well, why do this unless you're going to play with a level of perception, or you're going to play with this idea about, individual truth and unreliability, and actually have either some knock-on effect to the characters themselves or to the surrounding world, or make some sort of profound point. You know, Copenhagen, by the way you describe it, I've not seen it myself, but it's asking you to question bigger ideas, you know, around all of this story. It's asking you to question the nature of truth. And I don't think these Star Trek episodes do. And you think to yourself, well, are they, and I go back to my point in that, are they more about shoring up the heroism and the infallibility of these people ultimately than they are actually trying to make you question the nature of truth? And I watched all of these episodes and I enjoyed all three of them, to be honest. I think they're all perfectly solid, perfectly good episodes in their own way. But I left all of them thinking, what difference do they make? You know, and you know, when you watch Rashomon, yes, it's a film. It's not part of a series and it's not ongoing characters. But you come out of that film, which is nearly 70 years old, let's remember, and you are left thinking, you know, they are conceptually archetypal characters in, like you said, you know, this sort of ancient, almost fantasy sort of version of Japan. But it leaves you thinking about the nature of truth. And, you know, I'd like to see a modern Star Trek show have a go at a Rashomon story properly. You know, because maybe nowadays they maybe would have the license to really have this kind of plot matter more, you know, in the broader scheme of things.
Certainly, particularly a matter of perspective. You know, it's what 20 odd something is. I mean, there's an element of something slightly dated about it. I mean, both these episodes, you know, this is episodic Star Trek. It is going to kind of reset to the status quo to some degree. We can't really expect them not to do that necessarily. I mean, even as much as we might love there to be more deep, you know, character work and kind of more character development and so on. And maybe that's part of it. I mean, I think it's interesting. I felt, you know, because I went and read the source material for Rashomon as well, this story in a bamboo grove, and the short story Rashomon as well. I wouldn't say that's massively relevant to it. But I think the film is particularly good because I think the film adds a lot to, I mean, all the kind of plot stuff is pretty much all there in the story, basically. It's the kind of bare bones of it. But what the film does is by adding this framing narrative around it, which is the story that takes place in the rainstorm, basically, where people are effectively almost discuss, almost like, in the Muppet Show, where you've got those, you know, grumpy old guys kind of making comments from the sidelines. You know what I mean? Almost kind of commenting on the story as it's happening. Which in some ways seems like a bit of a cheap device, but actually that I think is where the film kind of pins down more of a theme. And you do have people sort of talking about, what's going on and what it means somehow. And you also have an element where they kind of feed into each other because in the end, it turns out that one of the characters who's in that frame narrative, is also lying, about something. I mean, like quite concretely lying about something that he's done. So it ties in quite nicely together. But apparently when they were making the film, that was a kind of sort of second draft aspect to it. You know, originally it was just going to be basically this short story. And then I think it was Kurosawa who said he wanted to bring in more somehow and either he or someone else had the idea of merging it with this other short story that Akira, is that his name? The writer, the same writer anyway, famous Japanese writer, had written another short story around the same time. These were both written, although the film is 1950, they were both written, I think one was 1911, one was 1915. So kind of, you know, very early 20th century, basically, and had written this quite evocative short story about a terrible rainstorm at this gate, basically. And they just took the setting from that. But it meant that they were able to kind of pinpoint the themes a little bit more. And in some ways you might think that would make it seem too on the nose and it would make it seem a bit obvious somehow. But for me, somehow it works. And maybe that's also, you know, it is a 1950 film. It's a black and white film. It's quite dated in certain respects now. I mean, I was watching on the train up to Liverpool and my partner was looking over my shoulder at this guy playing the bandit, kind of sweating and jumping up and down and cackling. and she sort of made a face at me like, you know, what on earth are you watching? Basically. I mean, it is like, it's certainly not how you would do film today, if you know what I mean. It's a document of its time, but certainly on its own terms, it's very effective and very compelling and very, striking and interesting and and it does feel like it's sort of grappling with something bigger than itself. I suppose maybe that's the issue with these, Star Trek episodes is they feel a little bit small somehow. Maybe the Worf episode, it did end up just being Perry Mason in space, and that wasn't, they were going for something more conceptual and more interesting, which arguably they succeeded massively within the Pale Moonlight. That was a kind of concept piece in a way that they absolutely pulled off. This one was maybe a concept piece that kind of ended up being a little bit more by the numbers, one way or another, because of the way that it kind of played out. But I mean, I don't dislike either of these episodes, really. I mean, I have, as I say, I have more of a problem with the Next Gen one, because I think there's this quite problematic sexual politics going on in it. But at the same time, it's not really about that. So I don't know, you kind of like, I can sort of enjoy it without getting too wrapped up in that, because I think the episode itself sort of loses interest in that so quickly. But I think it's an interesting trope. It's, Rashomon is definitely a very interesting film to go and see, and it is one that has been massively influential in various ways. I mean, I would say those X-Files episodes are probably more successful use of the trope in some ways. Yeah. Because they do something quite unique. And even within the scope of, yes, the X-Files did a lot of comic episodes in various ways, and they played on the absurdity of it all, and they sort of camped up the characters to some degree. But even within all of that, I think something like particularly Bad Blood does something quite clever with playing with this idea of, as I say, like Mulder's idea of who Scully is and Scully's idea of who Mulder is, and so on. It's not just saying these characters can be pushed. There's potential for, something slightly ridiculous about them, and we can exaggerate and make them ridiculous, particularly someone like Mulder. It's more interested in, like, how do they see each other? It does give you a genuine insight, even if it's exaggerated and silly, in a way that I think, you could say author does that with the Doctor in Voyager, but I feel author kind of squanders it slightly, because it makes it so absurd and so, I don't know, it kind of gets so sidetracked, that episode, that I feel that you lose the potential to feel that you've learnt something about the Doctor from it, because it becomes a courtroom drama at the end, and it tries to do a Measure of a Man, and the whole thing sort of goes off the rails one way or another. So I don't know, I think it's an interesting trope, but it's one that is maybe hard to pull off, but it is very popular. I mean, if you look, you can go to TV tropes and pull up the list. There are episodes, several episodes of Frasier that did it. There's an episode of ER that did it. There's episodes of, I can't remember. I did have a quick look through, and you'd be amazed at how many. I think there's an episode of The Simpsons that did it. It had a great line that Marge says to Homer that they're going to go to Japan or something, and she says, "Oh, you like Japan. You really enjoyed that film Rashomon," and he says, "Oh, that's not how I remembered it." It's very much a part of the kind of cultural landscape of cinema and certainly sort of 20th century storytelling, I suppose. And it does touch on these quite fundamental themes. As I say, by the time you get to a play like Copenhagen, it's a fundamental existential crisis, almost sort of existential moral crisis, at the heart of sort of human subjective existence. I mean, there is a kind of real weight potentially to this story. I don't think that's really where Star Trek is going with it in some way.
I think if Star Trek was to be braver about the consequences to the people involved, I think it could really pull it off fantastically well. I think that it is a really good trope. It's an overused trope, but it's persisted because it can lead to some thrilling drama. It can lead to, like you say, some thrilling existential drama, and can really make you, wonder about what you're watching, who you're seeing, and I think I just would like to see Star Trek be braver and really embrace it, and really leave you, do a true Rashomon story and leave you wondering at the end what was true, what wasn't. And I think it would be like I said, it would be very timely and prevalent to do a story like that, be it in Discovery, be it in Picard, or whatever is coming, all of the other shows to come, and really test the audiences. Because I think Star Trek could get away with it, particularly now. I think you could have a story. I mean, you could have even potentially done it on Enterprise, back then. I think you could have done it on any of these shows in some respects, but you had to be a bit bolder. And you said, they were episodic television, particularly of a specific time in the 80s and 90s. And it was a different time in terms of where, character development, things like that. But I think there is scope for Star Trek to do a really powerful story like this and to really make it work and leave you either wondering about the characters or wondering about Federation ethics or all kinds of things like that. And I hope they do it one day.
And DS9 would be the show to do it. I mean, they do have episodes, great episodes that kind of touch on elements of kind of moral ambiguity. I mean, I'm thinking something like, particularly around the occupation and stories like that. I mean, if you think of the episode where Kira finds out about her mother's relationship with Dukat, for example, I feel like that's an episode that leaves certain questions kind of unanswered to some degree.
Yeah.
It doesn't all tie it up in a bow. It doesn't, there is a sort of fundamental ambiguity to some degree about that relationship and about what's going on there. I feel like even stories like the one where, there are two episodes and I always get them mixed up in my head, but the one where Odo discovers that Kira actually was guilty of a crime that he thought she was innocent of. Maybe it's season 2.
Probably
Necessary Evil?
Necessary Evil or, I think so. And then the other one is Things Past.
Things Past, yeah. They're episodes that sort of revel in the murkiness of it, I suppose. And sometimes you can have something where even if it is tied up at the end, the murkiness is what you remember, if you know what I mean. And I think Star Trek can do that. And I think DS9 in particular did do that on various occasions. So I absolutely think, who knows, maybe it's time for a Discovery or the Picard show or, some other, Star Trek to do one of these. I suppose the problem is because it's a concept, it is quite an episodic concept in a sense, in that you would have trouble kind of stringing this out from week to week, probably. So I don't know whether it's something that we'll see coming back, but it's definitely, there's potential to do interesting things there. It's a kind of, on one level, it is kind of a formal trick. It is a bit, it is sort of high concept, a little bit of a game on the writer's part in some ways. And there's a lot of pleasure that comes from that, rewriting the same scene and reacting the same scene with slightly different intentions and slightly different nuances and so on. But there is also something to say about that, I think. And maybe it's true that, these two episodes, as much as, like you say, we both like them well enough, that there is definitely scope for something that kind of taps a richer vein within that, maybe. I think that's, maybe that's one thing that we can all agree on. Probably not.
Maybe not.
And if you disagree, and maybe, many people may disagree that there's anything wrong with these episodes and think that they're perfect. They may also think there are other examples where Star Trek does do exactly what we're saying that it should be doing. And I think that may well be the case. I mean, I think, as I say, DS9 in particular does, play in that kind of sandbox of ambiguity, one way or another, particularly if you think of, characters like Garak or some of these kind of storylines. And there are other storylines. I mean, we talked about a couple of Voyager episodes. I think there are other episodes of Star Trek that you could say touch on, if not the kind of Rashomon idea of kind of sort of bewildering subjectivity, at least the idea of kind of unreliable storytelling and kind of, and how truthful or trustworthy certain accounts might be. And it's something that, there's real scope there. I mean, one thing I'd say that I think is successful about Matter of Perspective, it's a clever idea to use the holodeck in that way. And as far as the episode suggests, it's just an idea that comes to Picard off the top of his head. No one's ever done this before. He says to Data, could we do this? I mean, that's a pretty, bold piece of, so that's thinking outside the box, if you know what I mean, to think, okay, we're going to recreate all these accounts and we're going to replay them in front of us and we're going to be able to sort of interact with them, even to the extent that literally we recreate something by accident that's going to blow up our ship if we're not careful. What I feel they missed a trick in one of the strangest parts of the film, Rashomon, is the bit where the dead man is interviewed himself through a medium who sort of, I was going to say impersonates, who kind of, conjures up the dead man to give his, and even his account is subjective and questionable. Whereas you might think, okay, all right, the dead man's the one person who's going to know how he ended up being dead and exactly what happened. I couldn't help thinking, because they do sort of do that in the Next Gen episode. They have the assistant of the guy who's been murdered who, recreates what he told her happened to him, but obviously before the point where he was murdered, or wasn't murdered, as the case may be. But Picard is very scathing about it. He says, that's hearsay evidence. We can't accept that. That's totally irrelevant. Which sort of begs the question, like, how is that any different like everything they're presenting is hearsay evidence in one sense, because it's like he said, she said, you know, and this is just he said, or she said, he said. But, you know, there's that sort of idea that it's not, this almost doesn't have a place here. I couldn't help thinking, you know, surely sci-fi is the one place where you could, you know, they could say, oh, we've got his memory engrams on file. We can recreate, you know, we can bring him back from the dead to answer these questions. And interesting, I don't know if you've seen, there's a new series on Netflix, which just debuted recently. I loved this show. I'd be interested to know if anyone else has been watching it. Almost all the reviews I've seen of it have hated it, and everyone seems to think it's terrible. I thought it was brilliant. It's a show with Katie Sackhoff from Battlestar Galactica.
Another Life. I've heard
and there's a character,
terrible reviews, yeah.
Well, okay, yeah. Look, maybe I'm just on another planet, but I thought it was great. I really enjoyed it. So I'd be interested to know what you think. But there's a character in that, and I don't know how to say what I'm going to say without slightly spoiling the first episode of this show. There's a character who is not alive, who you believe that you've seen the last of, and who then returns in the form of a kind of computer-generated, just like a hologram based on him, but so that people can ask questions of him relating to partly relating to the circumstances around his death and so on, and kind of what he was thinking and what was good, you know, and to kind of find out what would he say in this situation. So there's that weird idea of, you know, in this kind of sci-fi way, conjuring up the spirit of the dead almost, you know, just as in Rashomon, you've got this medium who conjures up the spirit of the dead man. I feel like that, you know, that next gen missed a trick in some ways by not following that aspect and doing something really weird and creepy with the holodeck, and actually bringing back the guy to give his account of what happened. But I suppose the problem is, well, he would lie probably, even if, well, I don't know. Then it creates this whole conceptual thing. If the computer's established, you know, if the computer's doing it, and we know that there is like, he does actually know what happened. Well, he might not know what happened to him, but he knows all the stuff that he's been doing, dodgy dealings and, you know, trying to sell this thing to someone other than the Federation and make a profit and all this sort of thing. How do you not know? Do you know what I mean? What you've almost got the Troy problem of like too much transparency, because on the one hand with these stories, you've got like the Copenhagen situation of like total fundamental existential uncertainty. On the other hand, you've got someone like Troy who's supposed to be able to kind of read people's minds, and therefore everyone is totally transparent. And certainly when it comes to things like whether they're lying or telling the truth or not, you know, even for Troy, they're supposedly completely transparent. So you kind of got these narrative problems, I suppose, whichever way you push it.
But it's interesting you say this about the holodeck and about how this works, because this is exactly what happens in Living Witness, in that they activate the Doctor unintentionally and they don't realise he's there, but then the Doctor is called upon to prove what he is saying is true to these disbelieving people who don't believe that their history was any different. And he has to go into a holodeck and recreate these events. And he says at one point that, you know, some of the technology is a bit, you know, I'm not quite sure about it. So some of this might be a bit subjective. It might not be completely on the level, but he has a good stab at creating, obviously, because it's Star Trek, he basically creates them exactly as they were, not quite. But, he creates what he considers to be the actual events. But there are moments, there are scenes where he wasn't there. There's a scene where Janeway's talking to I can't remember the name of the alien race or the character, but the first scene of the episode, you see Janeway, evil Janeway, let's call her, having this conversation with this alien guy, and then you see what is supposedly the real events, and she's normal Janeway, and she's having this much more nice, friendly Federation conversation. But that's the Doctor's, assumption that that's what she'd be doing. So he's in quite a lot of those scenes, but there are scenes where he's not, and you have to assume that the Doctor's true, and the Doctor's getting all this right, and it's factual. So in some senses, he's a fairly reliable narrator, because he's a hologram and he's a machine, and he's probably got better memory engrams and all this kind of thing to recall it. But at the same time, you have to go on a bit of faith. You as the audience have to go on a bit of faith with the Doctor. And he has to convince these guys, these alien races, to rethink their entire history and their entire 700 years. And he goes on and does that. But it's an interesting idea of using the holodeck and actually having this tool to, visualize these things, as opposed to, in Rashomon, it's all accounts, and again, in the Rules of Engagement doesn't use a holodeck, I don't think. unless I'm wrong, they don't use that holodeck. And I know it's a different kind of story almost, but it is all about accounts. It's about testimonies. It's about people saying, well, Worf is this, Worf is this. So you throw the holodeck in there, you've got a very different story. But I don't think it's quite been utilised yet to the best ability with this kind of Rashomon story. I think you could really do something very, very interesting that casts doubt on people. And yes, it wouldn't have to carry forward into an arc necessarily, into a story arc, but it could carry forward into a character arc. If you've got an event that happens, a murder or, a terrorist attack or whatever it is that happens, and then you see it from all these perspectives and you're left at the end not quite sure if the hero is a hero, then you've got an interesting character arc to follow through that this Rashomon trope could have been part of.
Interestingly, I guess with rules of engagement, it's not just about exactly what happened, because a lot of the testimony that's being given, it is almost more kind of character. They're sort of character witnesses to some degree. Do you know what I mean? Especially someone like Dax. I mean, really, she's trying to speak to Worf's character, and she's saying, look, we fight on the holodeck. He could break my neck. He doesn't. He's in control of stuff. And then there's this weird thing about almost like sort of violent computer games or something like that. They go on this tangent about, well, at the end of this game, doesn't he order that everyone gets slaughtered or whatever? And she's like, yeah, it's a hollow program. It's not real. But there's this kind of sense of like trying to get to know, who Worf is, like what are his values? What sort of a man is he in a sense? And apparently there was another section of that episode that was cut actually, which was, Kira's testimony, and Kira was going to give some kind of testimony about sort of Worf's character and his honor and his behavior and so on. And then her status as a character witness. I mean, I think this is interesting in terms of what we were saying about, the kind of ambiguities that DS9 plays with that other Star Trek shows don't. The Klingon then basically undermines her by revealing some sort of terrorist atrocity that she participated in the Resistance or something. So basically saying, this is not, we can dismiss this witness essentially because she's not a reliable source of information. So there's that kind of sense of how much do you, and obviously, we as viewers of DS9, we do trust pretty much, I mean, other than maybe Garak and possibly Quark, we do trust we trust someone like Kira, even as much as we occasionally might learn unpalatable facts about her past, if you know what I mean. We trust that she's a very honest, decent, good person. But I suppose that the episode does sort of play into these ideas of kind of, of the character of these people and the kind of idea of a character witness. And really that's why In the Pale Moonlight, as you said, is so interesting, is because it's a chink in the armor of like who Sisko is, in a sense, in that it is a kind of, a glimpse into his soul in a particularly tortured moment in a way. And, it does sort of reevaluate to some extent, who is this guy and what is he willing to do and what is he not willing to do? And it's certainly in a much deeper way than we get with Worf in Rules of Engagement. And apparently Rules of Engagement was originally pitched as a Sisko episode. It was going to be a Sisko episode, and then someone had the idea to make it about Worf instead and kind of tie it into this kind of ongoing Klingon storyline. And maybe it's tricky because the problem is, maybe we do have too many assumptions about these characters. Maybe we do know that Worf is so honourable and decent. He would never, he would never do something out of, he might get angry, but he would never do something that was completely unprincipled or morally wrong, if you know what I mean. Whereas, I don't know, in some ways, DS9 has characters like Odo. I mean, Odo can do things that are quite shocking. I mean, if you think of like, say, the old Odo who, in Children of Time, who, because he's obsessed with Kira, condemns all those people to be out of existence, or even the way that Odo behaves when the station is occupied. You do have characters in DS9 who can kind of surprise you with the way they behave in certain situations, because they're not necessarily the kind of paragons that we're used to in Star Trek. Worf, on the other hand, is so straight down the line. He's such a kind of, honourable, upstanding, a sort of rule following. Do you know what I mean? Like, even if sometimes these rules are not necessarily the Starfleet rules, there's kind of Klingon rules and stuff. It's sort of almost inconceivable that he would do something wrong. Do you know what I mean? Maybe that's part of the problem. Maybe it would have been better if it was a character who you actually was slightly more doubtful about to begin with.
Garak.
Yeah, well, yeah. If it was Garak, then you'd have a great story because you wouldn't believe a word that he says or that anyone says about him, or But then maybe you do get into this kind of radical uncertainty where it's just like, well, what's the point? Who knows? What he just lies all the time anyway. It almost doesn't mean anything.
It would have to be a point about something broader. I think it would have to not be about Garak, whether Garak's lying or not, because we know he lies. It would have to be a broader storyline about something, and that's where it differs, and that's where you didn't quite get those stories in Star Trek, particularly in Deep Space Nine, where most stories angled on a character and would develop a character. You occasionally had the sci-fi premise stories, but most of the time there would be a character story in the heart of that plot. And this was a Worf character story in the heart of that plot, and it was more about Worf's nobility and his relation to the Klingon Empire than it was about objective, subjective truth. So that's why it's not a perfect Rashomon story, and that's why we haven't quite got that yet. So come on, Star Trek, give us it. I'd love it now. Just do it with one of these characters on a Discovery. Do it with an Ash Tyler or someone like that. Someone who is a bit dodgy. We're not 100% sure about.
We need more of these dodgy characters. That's the answer, and I think we're getting more of them. I mean, we had it to some degree with Lorca until we discovered he was the kind of moustache twirling villain of the Mirror Universe. Yeah. We had this sense that here was a guy who was a little bit untrustworthy. Do you know what I mean? And I think there's definitely something interesting and quite compelling about that. So maybe that's something we will see going into the future. Well, I think hopefully we can, one thing we can both agree on is that it was fun talking about Rashomon and talking about these episodes.
I'm not sure.
No,
I'm not sure.
Right, okay.
I've got my own truth.
We'll have to
with
agree
this.
to disagree, and we'll open the conversation out on the Babel conference to anyone who wants to join in and give us your opinions. All opinions are welcome, very much welcome, and great to continue the conversation there. But this is not the only thing we've been talking about on Trek FM this week. So here's a listen to what else you might have missed out on the network.
Previously on Trek.fm, The Ready Room.
Is this the supernatural Klingon episode? What is this going to be? And then it just turns out to go in and dig your own time crystals, State Park. I mean, it's like, okay.
Larry,
again,
you go in there and there's a basket type thing there, and you put in your 10 quatlus and you get 60 minutes to dig your time crystal.
Dar6. Yeah.
Yeah, actually the Klingons want Dar6, don't they?
Yeah.
And you go in, and actually however many time crystals you can dig in 60 minutes, you get to keep. But the catch is they're time crystals. So 60 minutes to one person is only a minute to someone else.
Literary Treks.
We have the conversation between Pike and the Starfleet Admiral Terrell about the specifics of why they were kept out of the war. This is even before we're in a situation where they have no choice but to stay out of the war. They couldn't go back if they wanted to. By sort of setting up the milestones in the story for this is about when this is happening during season 1. That allows us to tell our own independent story within that, but yet also you'll always know where you are in the regular TV show.
Earl Grey.
That question about whether life exists, either yes it does, because enough time has elapsed and there's enough planets out there, or no it doesn't, because we are that race.
Oh.
that seeds life elsewhere in the universe at some point.
The other
in the
answer is it did, but they all destroyed themselves, But that's also kind of unlikely that you'd have lots of civilizations all doing the same thing and destroying themselves, I think. But to the journey!
That's
all I could think about with that one.
This is the Seinfeld in space episode.
I keep waiting for Elaine to show up.
I'm trying to think of what Jerry Seinfeld would say in Jerry Seinfeld's tone of voice inside this episode. Can you do a good Jerry Seinfeld?
Oh, good grief, no. Not even close.
I'm trying to think how I would approach doing a Jerry Seinfeld impersonation. It's not coming to me. He's got that super high-pitched da-da-da-da-da kind of voice.
Well, that you did really well, the da-da-da-da-da. So, yeah, there you go.
Why don't they just warp out of here?
And that's what else is happening on Trek.fm.
Check out all these shows and join the conversation about your favourite corner of the Star Trek universe and beyond. You'll find us wherever you get your podcasts. If you're an Apple user, be sure to hit the subscribe button in Apple Podcasts on iPhone, iPad, or Apple TV, or the desktop iTunes app to get the latest episodes as soon as they're published. And please leave us a star rating and a written review. If you're not an Apple user, we've got you covered as well. You can find our shows on Google Play Music, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spreaker, SoundCloud, Windows Phone, in most third-party apps, and you can stream and download the MP3 file from our website or grab the RSS link. We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's show, and there are many ways for you to do that. The best place to join in the larger conversation is the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type Babel, B-A-B-E-L, into the search field on Facebook and it should come right up. If you'd like to send us an email, you can use the form on our website at trek.fm/contact. Choose to send to a show and select Primitive Culture, and that will come right to us. You can also find the network on Twitter at TrekFM and on Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM. If you'd like to help us keep all our shows coming to you each week, you can become a patron of the network on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/TrekFM. That's patreon.com/TrekFM to get all the details. Perks include early access to episodes, exclusive content, producer credits, and more, available through our special patrons website, Patron Zone. It requires a great deal of money to produce, host, and distribute these shows each month, so we really appreciate any support you can give us, and we hope you'll join the team. Again, you can find all our details at patreon.com/TrekFM. We'd like to take a moment now to thank our associate producers on Primitive Culture, Amy Nelson, Clara Cook, and Tony Black. Amy is a presenter of many other shows on the network, and you can find her on Twitter at Miss Amy Nelson. Clara and Tony were two of the former co-hosts of this show, and they'll be popping back from time to time. You can find Clara on Twitter at ClaraJeanMC, and Tony at AJ Black Writer.
You're blended already.